I'm going to go through how to solve a one-step inequality when there is a negative involved. So we have talked about how to solve one-step inequalities when just a normal one-step inequality, and that's very similar to how do you solve a one-step equation. Okay, we've also talked about the rules for adding and subtracting numbers with different signs and multiplying and dividing numbers with different signs. And when we talked about that, we're talking about negatives. So we're going to apply those things to solving one-step inequalities when there is negatives involved. Okay, when you're adding and subtracting, nothing's different. Okay, so we're not going to go through a problem like that because nothing changes. You just add and subtract the one-step inequality or two-step inequality exactly the same as you would as we've talked about in the past. Okay, but when you're multiplying and dividing a one-step or two-step inequality, it's a little different. Okay, there's one thing that you got to remember. Okay, and I'm going to go through that. So let's say that we have negative 2x is greater than 4. Okay, negative 2x is greater than 4. So what we're going to do first is we are going to identify where the variable is, okay, because it's just like solving a one-step equation, okay, but instead we're solving a one-step inequality. So we're going to identify where the variable is. The variable's on the left side of the inequality, okay, and the variable is involved in multiplication because when the number is right next to the variable, it means multiplication. Okay, now a side note here, one thing that's really easy to do is because this negative is at the beginning, what's really easy to do is just assume that you have to add this to. That would be wrong, okay, and you need to make sure that you're identifying the fact that this number, this negative 2, is right next to the x. There's nothing in between it. Okay, so it's multiplication. So we have to use the opposite operation, just like if we were solving a one-step inequality or one-step equation. So the opposite of multiplication is division. So we're going to divide. Okay, so the goal is to get the variable alone. Well, when you're multiplying and dividing, in order to get the variable alone, you need to get it to 1x. Well, we have to ask ourselves, what can you divide by to get x all by itself or to get x at 1? Well, if we divide by negative 2, okay, it's important that we divide by negative 2 because negative 2 divided by negative 2 is 1. If we just divide by 2, negative 2 divided by 2 is negative 1. Negative 1 would not get the x alone. So we have to divide by negative 2. Okay? So this cancels, and you're left with x. Okay, now this is the change. This is the difference when you're solving a one-step inequality with a negative as opposed to not with a negative. Notice how we are dividing by a negative. Okay, we're dividing by negative 2. Because you are dividing by negative 2, because you're dividing by a negative, this inequality has to flip. So instead of being greater than, it's going to be less than, because we're dividing by a negative number. So you need to write this down. Anytime you divide or multiply by a negative, then the inequality flips. Anytime you multiply or divide by a negative, the inequality flips. Okay? So what we do to one side, we're going to do to the other side. So we're going to divide by negative 2. Okay? 4 divided by negative 2. Okay? 4 divided by 2 is 2. The rule for when you're multiplying and dividing numbers with different signs is that the answer is always negative. This is positive 4, this is negative 4. They're different. This is positive, this is negative. They're different. So the answer is going to be a negative number. So x is less than negative 2. Okay, so if we go back over that, we divided by a negative, which means on the left side because we wanted to get the variable alone. So we're going to divide by a negative on the right side because what you do to one side, you got to do the other. Because we divided by a negative. Because we divided by a negative, the inequality flipped. I'm going to say it again. If you divide by a negative or multiply by a negative, the inequality flips. Okay? And then you would, because this is an inequality, we want to show it visually, we would graph it. -2 comes on this side, open circle pointing to the left. Okay, let's try another one. Okay, this is a similar problem. We're going to go over this again. So, we need to solve for x. 3x is less than or equal to -6. In order to get x alone, we're going to divide because the number is right next to the variable. Okay, and the variable's on the left side, so that's where we're going to start. We're going to divide by 3 because 3 divided by 3 is 1, and that means x is alone. Okay, we are dividing, now this is where you ask yourself, are you dividing by a negative number? We are not dividing by a negative number. So this is going to stay the same because we're not dividing or multiplying by a negative. So it stays the same. What you do to one side, you do to the other. So -6 divided by 3. Okay? Now this is where it gets a little confusing. There's a negative in here. -6 divided by 3. That doesn't mean that you have to flip the inequality. It's only if you divide by a negative or multiply by a negative. We're dividing by a positive number. -6 divided by 3. So -6 divided by 3 is -2. Okay? Because 6 divided by 3 is 2. A negative divided by a positive is a negative. Okay? Signs are different. The answer is negative. So x is less than or equal to -2. So we would graph that again. This time it's filled in because the line's there. It means equal to, pointing to the left. Okay, let's try another one. Let's try one more. So we have x over -4 greater than -6. Okay, this is division. So the opposite of division, because x divided by -4, the opposite of division is multiplication. So we're going to multiply by -4. Because we're multiplying by -4, on the left side we're going to multiply by -4 on this side. These cancel, so we're left with x. We multiplied by a negative. So that means the inequality is going to flip. -6 times -4. 6 times 4 is 24. A negative times a negative. The signs are the same. So when you're multiplying and dividing and the signs are the same, your answer is positive. When you're multiplying and dividing two numbers that are the same, the answer is positive. And you should remember that from the previous section. Okay? Since it's an inequality, we're going to graph it. Graph should look like that. Shows that any x could be any number less than 24. It's not filled in because x cannot be 24. Okay, so multiplying and dividing, one-step inequalities, when you're multiplying and dividing, you have to remember, if you are dividing or multiplying by a negative, we multiplied by a negative here, since we multiplied by a negative, the sign flipped. Okay, that's really important to remember. Otherwise, it's just like solving a regular one-step inequality, and then you have to remember the signs for multiplying and dividing negative numbers. Okay? If you have any questions, make sure you ask. Okay, this can be kind of confusing, so make sure that you have it dialed in before you start the practice. Okay, if you got to watch the video again, if you got to go over another problem, make sure that you do that. But make sure that you know what's going on before you do the assignment that goes with this.